Okay, so welcome to another edition of Raisina 2025 Ideas Pod. In this special session, we would be discussing, we will be taking stock of the Asian century, as it were. And to talk about all things Asia and the world, I have with me a very special guest, Kishore Mahbubani, at the moment a distinguished fellow with the Asian Research Institute, NUA Singapore. But he's much more than that. He has been a writer, an author, and perhaps one of our singular thinkers on Asia and how the Asian political order, geopolitical order has evolved over the last several decades. So, sir, welcome. I think let's start from the beginning, because you have talked a lot about Asian century, Asian values. You have been a big exponent of that, proponent of that. How, when you look back at your assessment of the last few decades, what all you got right and what all you got wrong? I think let's start from there, and then we push on into the territory where what is happening at the moment.
But you're absolutely right when you say that. I've been writing about the rise of Asia or return of Asia for several decades now. In fact, going back to 1992, I spent a year in Harvard, 91, 92, at a time when the West was feeling incredibly triumphant after the end of the Cold War, and Francis Fukuyama said the West had reached the end of history, and the rest of you poor chaps, you have to become like us. And I remember at a Harvard seminar with a very famous Harvard professor called Professor Stanley Hoffman, and I said this, in 91, 92, that actually the future will be Asian. His face went red. He almost became apoplectic. What do you mean? It's the West. So I think one thing, what is shocking is that the greatest Western minds have not realized two basic points. The first basic point is that for most of human history, especially over the last 2,000 years, China and India always had the largest economies for 1800 out of the last 2,000 years. So the last 200 years have been a major historical aberration. And now you're seeing the natural return of Asia. And it's happening at a dramatic speed, And like one statistic I give, 100 years ago, Europe could run the world. As recently as 1980, the combined economy of the European Union was 10 times the size of China. 1980, Europe 10 times the size of China. Today, they're about the same size. By 2050, Europe will be half the size of China. Now, when Europe goes from being 10 times the size of China to becoming half the size of China in one lifetime, it shows you how much the power has shifted to Asia. You also asked me what I got wrong. I assume that since the West had traditionally been dominated by relatively rational thinking, and believes that at the end of the day, you must work out the most rational long-term policies for, getting the West to adjust to the new world. I thought they'd be rational, but instead they have been irrational. And certainly when you elect a man like Donald Trump, who's driving forward by looking at the rear view mirror to make America great again, he wants to bring America back to the past. He doesn't understand that now it's a different world.
So from the end of history now to almost the return of history, if you will, in the sense of Europe in particular, there is this big debate about the return of geopolitics as if it ever went away. Here comes Mr. Trump, as you were describing. Now, he's disrupting a lot of the assumptions, around which a lot of Western foreign policy has revolved, whether you look at his assumption about the economic globalization and how you interpret that and its impact on national societies, whether you look at the impact of and the role of multilateral institutions in global politics, whether you look at the role of identity in shaping foreign policy. How lasting do you think the impact would be? Because you can interpret it in multiple ways, right? You can say that, look, he's an aberration because there is a consensus in American foreign policy around certain core themes. Those assumptions would hold. He will be there for 4 more years, and maybe Trumpism in some form would remain. but the core sort of American identity of foreign policy would be retained. So you would go back to transatlantic solidarity, you would go back to Europe being the primary theater of operations, etc. So are you optimistic along those lines, or do you see a fundamental churn happening insofar as what Mr. Trump represents?
I think what you described very well is what I call the consensus among many Western liberals, that essentially we've been running the world very well. Now there comes along this guy whom I think Gideon Rutman called a moron, Donald Trump. Okay, he's a temporary problem. He'll go away, and then we can go back to the good old days of the past. And this is where the liberals get it completely wrong. And the reason they get it completely wrong is that they don't try to understand, forget Trump. Who are the people who voted for Trump? Why did the majority of the people vote for Trump? Not once, twice, right? And after a 4-year interval. Because the liberals have let down the peoples of their own society. And you know, the United States is a modern developed country. It's the only modern developed country where life expectancy has come down as an indicator of social problems. And the bottom 50% have not seen any improvement in their standard of living for over 30 years now. And it is this anger of the bottom 50% that the liberals have created an order which benefited them a great deal. They all became rich and wealthy and so on and so forth, partly through the universities and all that, and they ignored the masses. So Trump understood this anger, and Trump is riding this anger. And if the liberals want to go back to the good old days of the past, they first got to ask themselves very honestly, why did we fail our own people? Why did we not recognize that our people were in acute distress? You know, this Nobel laureate Angus Deaton has written a book called Deaths of Despair, which gives tremendous number of statistics of how people are dying from despair. So first, if you really want to address the problem of Trump, forget Trump the individual, focus on the bottom 50%. And by the way, one important fact to add here is that functionally the United States has also become a plutocracy, where most of the wealth is going to top 1%, 0.1%. And you know, and if you have a plutocracy, you know, as I said in a recent Oxford Union debate, it's by definition the opposite of a democracy. So there are some fundamental challenges that the liberals have to deal with if they want to go back to the good old days.
So coming back to our part of the world, Asia, Asia Pacific, Indo-Pacific, whatever the term people might want to use, but now the impact of what is happening in the West on this part. And you have written a lot about, as we started this conversation, about the Asian century. Now, the first 25 years of this century have seen dramatic shifts. You know, there have been enormous economic cooperation, economic interdependence, trade flourishing among countries, but also a degree of contestation that you have had, and particularly under Xi Jinping, a more aggressive Chinese foreign policy leading to pushback from various quarters in the region. Now, when you look at the next 75 years, if one can look at in this day and age of massive change and massive churn, what is your assessment that the idea of Asia, how potent that would remain, because you are looking at this region as a center of gravity of global economics first and global politics thereafter?
Yeah, let me begin by mentioning a small fact that sort of illustrates the point that the world is psychologically preparing for the Asian century. You know, I came out with a book of open access, free book, with Springer Nature, a German publisher. And I asked the German publisher, this book it's called The Asian 21st Century, what's your target? How many downloads should we try to get with this open access book? They said if we get 20,000 downloads, it'll be a great success. Well, instead of 20,000 downloads, there have been close to 4 million downloads of this book in 160 countries. I mention this because it shows you that psychologically, people around the world are saying that it is going to be the Asian century. And the data shows very clearly how economic power is shifting rapidly. I mean, if you want to talk about I compared China to the EU. If you compare China to the US, in the year 2000, US was 8 times bigger than China. Today is 1.5 times bigger. When in the year 2000 began, UK was in the top 5, India was not in the top 10. Today, India is in the top 5 and UK is falling out of the top 10. It's an example of how the world is changing and churning as a result of the return of Asia. And I am actually very optimistic for Asia because most Asians realize that this is their hour. But to succeed, the most important thing you have to do is ensure you don't get caught in major wars. And when the Cold War ended, I've cited several American political scientists who said Asia's future will be Europe's past, that World War III, World War IV will happen in Asia because that's where the power shifts are happening. But we've had a long peace, 46 years of no major wars in Asia. And by contrast, you see the Yugoslav wars, the Ukraine war, the wars are happening on the fringes of Europe. So Asia is getting some things right. And that's what we need to understand. And one important point that I hope more people will pay attention to is the role of ASEAN, in Southeast Asia.
I'm about to come to that.
Because, ASEAN is by far the most diverse region of planet Earth. Among the 700 million people, you have 250 million Muslims, 150 million Christians, 150 million Buddhists, Mahayana Buddhists, Hinayana Buddhists, you have Taoists, you have Confucianists, you have Hindus, and we have lots of communists in Southeast Asia. There's no other region in the world that is as diverse as Southeast Asia is. And look at this region. It's become one of the most peaceful and prosperous corners of planet Earth. I mean, I think any Indian would be shocked to learn that in the decade 2010 to 2020, ASEAN, which is 1/5 the size of the European Union, added more to global economic growth than the European Union did. It's a stunning statistic, you see. So there are some things that are being done right down there. And within the region also, there's a lot of emphasis on opening up the trade. And the world's largest free trade agreement, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, is functioning in the region. We wanted India to join. As you know, sadly, India decided not to join. But the door is always open for India to come and join the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. But I can tell you, when future historians look at our time, they'll actually be quite amazed at what we in Asia have accomplished in the first 25 years of this Asian century. And the next 25 years will be even better.
So just on this point, Kishore, on ASEAN centrality, if you see most of the players in the region, they do talk of ASEAN centrality. Some are better at it than others in operationalizing that idea.
Yeah.
But the issue that I thought, if you can just deliberate a bit more, is that even if we keep ourselves away from wars, the sense that a great power competition is looming, that is becoming, almost that is taken as a given now. And across administrations, from Trump 1.0 to Biden to now Trump 2.0, there are indications of that competition, particularly on technology, becoming much more direct and much more tenuous. Now, so the question now is, how do countries in the region secure their space from this competition and allow their agency to flourish? Because, as you know, the biggest problem ASEAN had been facing or had faced traditionally is this economic partnership with China versus security partnership with the US, and how do you balance the two? Some countries get it right, some countries don't. But by and large, ASEAN has done well in navigating that trend. But that was when the competition was at a much lower level. Now as it accelerates, do you see that sense that we will get it right this time also? Now that the structural realities are moving in a very, very difficult space, especially over the next few years.
Well, there's absolutely no question that the US-China contest will accelerate over the next 10 to 20 years. And I wrote a book, Has China Won, about it. And it's an iron law of history that when the world's number one emerging power today is China, is about to overtake the world's number one power. which today is the US, the world's number one power will always push down the world's number. It's like a mechanical thing that happens in history. So there's no question. But the question is, how do you manage it? And I actually think it can be managed, And for example, I think Donald Trump, if his first priority is to grow the American economy, while he'll be tough on China, he's also open to a deal on China. So that in that sense he might be not completely bad news for China. And in the case of ASEAN, you're right. ASEAN has made every effort to be friends with China, to be friends with the US, and we have actually succeeded in a spectacular fashion. Let me just give you some data. In the year 2000, US trade with Southeast Asia, with ASEAN, was 135 billion, and China's only 40 billion, so less than one-third US trade. By 2022, US trade had gone to 500 billion, but China's trade with ASEAN had grown to almost 1 trillion, 975 billion, from 40 to 9. So these are phenomenal figures, okay? It was the world's largest trading relationship. But at the same time, we also have a situation whereby the US has invested more in ASEAN than it has in China, Japan, Korea, and India combined. Even though China, Japan, Korea, and India are much bigger economies than ASEAN is. So it shows you there's some degree of geopolitical acumen in Southeast Asia that has been developed over the years. So I'm reasonably confident that we can navigate these difficult geopolitical waters.
Kishore, I just want to end, but I have to ask this question, one final one, if you can be very brief. You've talked about rising and falling powers and how they relate to each other. So the reality of China rising is also a fact, that it is right. Its interests are expanding, and some have viewed China's rise as an economic power and related it to somewhat expansionist ideas that it has had in South China Sea or East China Sea or with borders in the Himalayas. Do you see that trend also through the lens of a rising power trying to shape its periphery, or is there some other explanation, perhaps domestic politics, or perhaps the personality of the present Chinese president? How do you assess that dynamic?
I always begin by emphasizing one point: the idea that you can have a benevolent great power. But the term benevolent great power is an oxymoron. All great powers, including United States, China, will put their interests first. And there's absolutely no question that China will become far more assertive as it becomes stronger and bigger and more muscular. But there's a big difference between being assertive and being aggressive. So I predict that China will become more assertive, but it won't become more aggressive. Because one of the things the Chinese have learned over 2,000 years, that the worst way to win a war is to fight it. So the first goal of any good Chinese leader is to avoid wars. I mean, you still exercise influence, they have a lot of impact and all that, but you don't get involved in wars. Because wars at the end of the day is what will drag you down, and wars at the end of the day will prevent China from achieving what it wants to become, which is the number one economy in the world.
So whether in South China Sea or in Taiwan Strait, you see a more optimistic scenario over the next years?
I predict that there will be no wars there.
Okay. Thank you so much, Kishore. It was fascinating to talk about Asia, China, Trump administration, and how the world is changing so rapidly. Perhaps also taking stock in the process of how the century is evolving and in which direction. It was a fascinating conversation that covered a lot of track. I hope we had more time, but thank you, Kishore, for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Harsh.
Thank you.